Class, and welcome to week 5, in which we talk about student diversity. Our vocabulary preview is here. These are the words you need to put on your vocabulary template if you're doing the extra credit assignment. Even if you're not, you need to pay attention and understand what these words mean. So, when we think about all the students in our class, we think of a richness of diversity along various categories. So, for example, we could talk about different genders, and nowadays we talk about more than two genders. We could talk about social class and race and ethnic groups, disabled or non disabled. We could talk about diversity in religion, and we could talk about diversity in regions, where the students from, where they live now. So, there's a lot going on in this, and this uh, PowerPoint does a little bit to unpack some of that. First of all, let's talk about socioeconomic status. Unless you teach in a very affluent district or you teach in a very uh, uh, impoverished district, you're probably going to have in your class students from various socioeconomic statuses. And we abbreviate that SES. It's another term for social class. And it thinks about this individual's income and their parents' occupation and education and prestige in society. You might hear words like upper class, middle class, or lower or working class to describe SES. Many children from low income or low SES families receive an upbringing that is less consistent with expected school behavior than do middle class families. And an important difference between middle class and lower class families is the kinds of activities parents tend to do with children. So this just makes sense if you think about it, and a raft of research supports it. Middle class families have more disposable income, they're more financially secure, they get more vacation time. So there's a lot more going on in terms of enrichment for children. Middle class children might have access to more books, they might be taken to museums, they might be able to do a lot of things that their economically challenged counterparts can't do. And this shows up in school very early and it shows up consistently. Some of you might have heard of the program Head Start. That was a decades long program designed to try to take children in preschool and even earlier and equalize some of those disadvantages. Often children from low-income families are placed at risk for school failure by the characteristics of the communities they live in and the schools they attend. So if you think about it, if you go home and you're hungry and you don't have enough to eat, probably homework is going to be the last thing on your mind, as opposed to your middle class or affluent counterpart where they don't have to worry about food, and so they have the luxury of doing homework and maybe even having a parent at home to help them. School funding in most areas of the United States is correlated with social class. Middle class children are likely to attend schools with greater resources, better paid teachers, and other advantages. There are certain areas of concern for low SES children. You might see these in your classroom. Generally, low SES children have inadequate access to health care. Maybe one or both parents are unemployed, and usually health care insurance comes from our employment. So they may not be able to go to the doctor the way other students can. They may have severe vision impairment. As a matter of fact, the research shows they have it at twice the normal rate, and they may not be able to afford glasses. So you may see them squinting in your classroom and not understand why, but they may just not see the board. They may experience more hearing problems. They may be exposed to lead. In the 1970s, the government passed a regulation that banned paints containing lead, but many old tenements and old buildings still have rooms in apartments with paints that contain lead. And what happens is children will peel this paint off and eat it. And so they're far more likely to live in these homes where they eat this paint and leading to terrible health effects, or where it gets into the air. Dust from OLED paint gets into the air and they inhale it, leading to problems with their health. Asthma, they have high rates of asthma, and like we said, less medical care. Um, Unhealthy diets are common, and part of the reason of this is they may live in what we call food deserts. If parents don't have access to a car, then they may not have a grocery store around, and so they may be forced to eat fast food or junk food just because they can't get any other thing. Another way students are diverse is race and ethnicity. Ethnicity. Folks confuse these two terms all the time, and so let's get them straight. Um, Ethnicity is a constructed term. It means a shared identity with a common culture. So this isn't something you're born into necessarily. It's something that um, you look at your culture and you're either born into it or adopt it. So you might consider yourself Jewish, for example. You might consider yourself Muslim. You might consider yourself Hindi. Uh, so there are lots of different cultures, Native American, but it's not necessarily a race. Race is classification based on ancestry or genetics. Um, the five the five classifications that you see here are the American government classifications: American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white. So the problem with this is it's very problematic. We can't put people into neat, discrete categories. Um, if you've ever had your DNA analyzed from Ancestry.com or 23andMe, what you'll realize very quickly is that we're all a mix of these things. And so science is coming more and more to frown upon these racial categorizations. However, schools still use these terms, and so it's important to know what they mean. Underrepresented groups are groups found less often in situations of economic security and power. And when we talk about underrepresented groups, we have to talk about um, an application. So, for example, women are underrepresented in science and technology, but men are underrepresented in teaching. And so when you talk about underrepresented groups, it varies depending upon what the application is. Underrepresented groups generally tend to score lower on all standardized forms of assessment due to factors related to nurture. So if you remember our nature versus nurture debate, it makes sense that underrepresented groups will have less or fewer experiences that enable them to achieve. So, for example, let's get back to our women in science and technology. Women, one school of thinking goes that women are given fewer opportunities in science and technology. They are given fewer toys to play with at younger age that encourage that kind of thing. And so this leads to an underrepresentation in science and technology. So now let's get into gender as a factor in students' education. So I want you to understand the difference between two terms, sex and gender. A child's sex is a visible, permanent attribute, and permanent from the standpoint of it's what they're born with. It's not permanent in the standpoint of what they necessarily will continue with their whole lives. Gender is a more socially constructed term. So a child is born and their sex is either biologically, externally male or female. Gender is more socially constructed. And so we've been seeing in recent years the development of transgender individuals, for example, that don't identify with their biological sex, and so they identify with another gender. Cross-cultural research indicates that gender roles are among the first that individuals learn. So we see this watching preschoolers, for example, when they play at house. They're very segregated. Especially as they get into kindergarten, early elementary school, they take on those gender roles. All societies treat males differently from females. They don't all treat them the same way, but all societies make a distinction between males and females. And what is considered natural behavior is often based more on cultural belief than on biological necessity. So there's been a great deal of research, and there's been a great deal in the press about differences between boys and girls. And so what we need to take away from this course is that there's actually few differences in intellectual ability. There's been a whole bunch of research on what are the differences between men and women, boys and girls. Men or boys tend to score higher on general knowledge, mechanical reasoning, and mental rotation measures. So, what that means is, do you remember the SAT items you took where you had to take a figure and rotate it 90 degrees? Men tend over time to score a little bit higher on that. Not a lot higher, but some higher. And some researchers think this may actually help explain why there are more male engineers, more male architects. Men also have a higher rate of learning disabilities and emotional disorders, and they tend to cluster at both high ends of the intellectual curve, both ends, high and low. So what that means is you've got more male geniuses, but you've also got more men on the low end of the intellectual curve. Women tend to cluster more in the middle. Now, this is a chart of SAT scores, and what you see here is that men consistently score higher in math than women. But if I were to ask you, do men and women, which gender scores higher in the other part, the verbal, what would you say? Well, you would probably say that men score higher, women score higher in verbal because that's the stereotype. Men are better at math and women are better at reading and verbal. But actually, men score higher in both and have for the past 30 something years. Stereotype threat. This is a well researched phenomenon. It refers to individuals who are aware of a stereotype about a group to which they belong, becoming anxious about confirming the stereotype, and their anxiety causes them to perform below their real abilities. So there was a famous study a number of years ago in which researchers took classes of students and and they said, we're going to give you a math test. They assigned the students to either control group or an experimental group. In the control group, they just came in and they said, we're going to give you a math test, and they gave the math test. But in the experimental group, they came in and they said, we're going to give you a math test. Girls, just do the best you can. They didn't say girls were worse. They didn't say anything other than just girls do the best you can. And guess what happened? Consistently, girls in the experimental group perform lower than men and also lower than girls in the control group, meaning that just hearing that statement caused them to experience anxiety. And this is what we mean by stereotype threat. When you feel threatened because you're a part of a group and you buy into the stereotype. Obviously, the stereotype threat is of greatest concern for members of underrepresented groups. Now we need to talk about implicit bias because it can impact you as a teacher. Implicit biases are subtle, often subconscious stereotypes that guide our expectations and interactions with people. And we all have them. We may not acknowledge it or know that they're there, but a raft of research suggests that they are there even if we don't acknowledge them. We have certain beliefs about groups of people. You're going to watch a video in this module about a study that was done at a Yale Center preschool. 135 preschool teachers were shown videos of children misbehaving, and they were told to watch for misbehavior. Well, what the participants didn't know is these were teachers who were the participants, and they didn't know that their eye movements were being tracked. And what the researchers found is that teachers' eyes were tracking the black uh, preschool children, and specifically the males. Um, Even though there was no misbehavior, teachers were much more likely to watch black male students. And this is what we mean by implicit bias. And I won't say any more about that because you're going to watch a video regarding it. So, what can we as teachers do to avoid bias in teaching? Teachers, usually without being aware of it, exhibit bias in classroom teachers in two principal ways. They reinforce existing stereotypes and they treat students differently based on their membership in a group. So, some things you can do: avoid stereotypes. For example, assign jobs in the classroom without regard to gender. Don't just have the boy take out the trash or the girl, you know, clean off the whiteboard. Maintain high expectations for all students, regardless of their group. Promote integration by encouraging collaboration, seating across groups, and participation in sports activities by everyone. Try to treat students equally by allowing all students equal opportunities to participate in class, to take leadership roles, and to engage in all kinds of activities. Call on students equally. Develop a system to ensure you call on students about the same number of times. Some teachers will do this by putting everyone's names in a jar and pulling them out one at a time, for example. Support bilingual education, which research suggests that bilingual education enables students to learn English rapidly. For a moment, think about the certification requirements that you'll need to know. In your certification test, you should be able to describe ways that students are diverse, which we've covered in this lecture, and work to ensure equitable practices. They take into account this diversity in the classroom. This is about giving all students access and all students opportunities. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Enjoy the rest of the module, and we'll see you next week.